Tonight, we are going to be having a talk about how Pluto reshapes our world, insights from the Egyptian bounds. And Dan Waits is here in the room with us, and he's going to be telling us all about this. And the Egyptian terms or bounds are mysterious divisions of each of the signs into 5 unequal sectors, and they were held to be very important by traditional astrologers. Examining Pluto's transits through the lens of the bounds can shed light on the past 15 years of history, including the Trump presidency, the MeToo movement, the Islamic State, the 2008 financial crisis, COVID-19, and the war in Ukraine. Dan's going to last 15 years. Dan has said he's going to be giving us intriguing clues into how Pluto's current out. So to introduce Dan, Dan Waits is a consulting astrologer, researcher, and content creator on YouTube. He's focused on world and natal astrology, and he says, "My goal is to use astrological wisdom and historical research to understand the times we're living through and help more people cross the threshold into a magical cosmos." His writing on world astrology can be found at worldastrologyreport.substack.com. His YouTube channel is World Astrology Report, and his website for bookings and contact is danwaitesastrology, all one word, .com, and all of that can be found on our website, and perhaps even in our chat box if anyone was able to post it there. So Dan, thank you for joining us. It's lovely to see you. We're very, very glad to have you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Very, very honored to be speaking to you all today. So let's get into this. Okay, so how Pluto reshapes our world, insights from the Egyptian bounds. Let's start just by looking at our friend Pluto today. So we can see, I just took a little shot from my astrology software, just showing where we find Pluto. And you can see Pluto here at the very end of Capricorn, 29 degrees and 29 minutes, retrograde, of course, having already taken a few steps into the sign of Aquarius. Now, if you look at the chart that I'm displaying here, you'll see that we can see the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius, but we've also got these other divisions of the signs visible, and these are the Egyptian terms or bounds. Now, you may have run across these, particularly if you've studied traditional astrology. They're a very important feature of traditional astrology. And essentially what I want to talk to you about today and to demonstrate is how we can use these bounds to almost understand the process of Pluto as it moves through the signs. You know, Pluto moves very slowly relatively to all the other planets. So it spends quite a lot of time even in these small divisions of the signs. And this is something I've looked into, particularly with a particular focus on Capricorn and Aquarius. And that's what I really want to show you today. So here's a full chart. Again, no planets, but just to show you the Egyptian terms and bounds. There are actually several systems of these terms or bounds, and they divide the zodiac in slightly different ways. There's the Egyptian bounds, there's the Ptolemaic bounds, which were devised or discovered, depending on who you believe, by Ptolemy, and there's another system, the Chaldean bounds. The Egyptian bounds, as far as I'm aware, seem to be the oldest of the systems. This was the system that was used by traditional astrologers of the Hellenistic era, also of the sort of up to the medieval era. other systems became more popular. Ptolemy's system became popular in the Renaissance period. But this is the system, and you can see that each of the signs is divided into 5, and these divisions of the signs are also unequal. It's not a sort of geometrically pleasing division of the signs. That you can, if you look at the different divisions, they're of different sizes, and each of these bounds is ruled by one of the 5 traditional planets, with the exception of the luminaries, the sun and the moon. So Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, each of these planets rules one bound in every sign. And you can even see that the order of these rulerships changes in each sign. So it's very mysterious. Why the signs divided like this? These strange unequal divisions that appear in different orders. We don't really know, because there is no explanation in any of the old texts that we have as to really why they're divided like this, which is why I've described them as mysterious. There are people that have made an attempt to try and reconstruct maybe what the logic of the order of the planetary rulerships of the bounds might be. People have made some valiant efforts, and you can find some of that on the internet. I think Deborah Holding is one person who's worked a bit on that. But one thing that we can see, which is worth pointing out, is that the final bound of every sign is either Mars or Saturn, the 2 so-called malefic planets. They always rule, one of those 2 planets always rules the last bound of each sign. Which is quite interesting. The malefic planets in traditional astrology would also be thought of as almost the destroyers, in a sense. It's interesting that there's a sort of that the destroyer rules the end of each sign, and that makes me kind of think about the idea of creative destruction. We can't have continuous growth. Things need to be cut away and pruned away, so that the new can take its place. But that's kind of by the by right now. Now, just to give you another example, here are the bounds of Sagittarius, and just to show you how unequal they can be, we can see that greedy Jupiter here has 12 degrees of Sagittarius. Mars, the final bound of the sign, has just 4. So, why might the signs be divided this way? We don't really know. Could it have to do with the fixed stars, perhaps? Because is it kind of lost to time? That, I mean, fixed stars might have something to do with it, or was this perhaps just some kind of revelation to somebody at some point? We really don't know. But they are very commonly used by astrologers going back to the Hellenistic period, and they see them as extremely important. They're not just some kind of optional feature of traditional astrology. All the traditional astrologers going back to the Hellenistic period, pretty much, with a few exceptions, use these bounds and consider them to be very important. So what do they do? What are they? How can we think about them? An analogy that I like is to think of them as rooms in a house. So we have, the house of Capricorn, and each of these planets rules one of the rooms. So that each of the rooms are they are all Capricornian, but they're somehow the domain of one of these 5 planets. And you can imagine that, therefore, the significations associated with each of those planets are going to play a much more important role within that bound of the sign. Another way to think of the bounds is to think of them as states in a country. It's a similar kind of analogy there. This is a quote from Firmicus Maternus, Roman astrologer. "We must observe these terms, also known as bounds, carefully. For when a planet is found in its own terms, it is just as if located in its own sign." Now, before we move on, we're just a little bit on Pluto, just to make sure that we're all sort of up to speed with that. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what Pluto means and does in astrology. But of course, Pluto was also known as Hades in Greek mythology, was the lord of the underworld. So somehow this dwarf planet, which takes 248 years or something like that to orbit the sun, has been named after the lord of the underworld. And that is really quite key, in my opinion, to understanding what Pluto is all about. We can think about Pluto or Hades as a power secreted beneath the earth. And thus, we often see with Pluto that it has to do with expressions of power which come from almost from the invisible realm, from the hidden realm, and yet transform our world. Of course, with the analogy of the Lord of the Underworld, we can think about the whole process of death and rebirth, which often comes into play where Pluto is concerned. And if we think about the period of time when Pluto was discovered in 1930. This was a time when science was unlocking, theoretically at least, the power of the hidden structure of the universe, of these tiny particles, of quantum theory, atomic theory, figuring out how things were really constructed, and which before long, of course, resulted in the creation of the atomic bomb, a release of great power that is essentially born of the invisible atomic realm, which we can't see, but we somehow are able to harness and release the great power stored within. Of course, similarly at the same period, 1930s, this was the rise of fascism. So we have these kind of simple ideas which transformed entire societies and, of course, consumed the whole planet in war eventually. And one last thing, Pluto also has to do with the theme of wealth. Wealth was something that you would find underground and still do to this day, gems, gold, and all those valuable things. And Pluto was conflated with another god, which was the god of wealth. So we often see where Pluto is concerned, the theme of great wealth. This is where we get the word plutocrat, and so on. So just a little bit of background and what we're really thinking about when we talk about Pluto. But in summary, we want to think about Pluto as an agent of transformation in astrology. So now we're going to talk about Pluto through the bounds. I have a little animation here just to show you. I've recorded this for my astrology software, just showing how Pluto moves through the bounds of a sign. And what you can see, of course, is that Pluto is moving in a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of manner, because, of course, it stations direct, it moves forward, stations retrograde, retraces its steps, and so on. So this is the way that Pluto moves through the signs and the bounds. And what this means is that if we're trying to look back and create a chronology of Pluto's movement through the bounds or even the signs, there's a little bit of we don't get a very clean chronology, because, of course, Pluto will step into a particular, say, sign or bound, but then move back out of it again, and then move back in it again. And this is something, obviously, we've seen this year with Pluto moving in and out of Aquarius already. So just as an example, here are the dates that Pluto was in the Mercury bound of Aquarius the last time. And you can see that we really need 4 spans of dates in order to specify precisely when Pluto was really in a particular bound. Now, that complicates things a little bit. But in what follows, I'm just going to mention the date when Pluto moves into a bound for the first time and when it leaves it for the last time, and consider that the span of its movement through that bound. So we're going to start by looking at Pluto's progress through Capricorn. So I've just put up here the size of the 5 bounds of Capricorn. The first bound is Mercury, 7 degrees. Then we have Jupiter, 7 degrees. Then we have Venus, 8 degrees. And then Saturn gets 4 degrees. And then the final 4 degrees go to Mars. So now we're going to consider the news events and the stories and the transformations that took place over this past 15 years of history from 2008, January 26, 2008, when Pluto first entered Capricorn. And of course, when Pluto first entered Capricorn, it entered the Mercury bound of Capricorn. Now, of course, Mercury is a planet associated with trade, with markets, and we all know what happened in 2008. Right around that time, we had the subprime mortgage crisis. We had one of the greatest financial crises we've seen in a long time, with Pluto in that bound of Mercury. It was a crisis which was affecting banks. If you think about Capricorn as a sign that has to do with institutions, with the banking industry in general, you'd think that the Mercury bound in particular, that when knowing that Mercury is associated with trade and markets, it's very interesting to see that we have that crisis with Pluto, the Lord of transformation, in that particular bound, 2008. Now, of course, there was a reaction to what happened in 2008 because, as we know, we saw a great crisis in the banking sector, which required the banks to be bailed out at great cost with Plutonian quantities of money. And not everybody, of course, felt this was fair. These banks had become too big to fail. And there was a reaction to what happened there. And that reaction, as you can see pictured down here, was, at least one of them was Occupy Wall Street, a protest movement in the US, in the UK, in various parts of the world, against this kind of form of capitalism that seemed to have developed, against the bailout of the banks. One thing that Mercury is associated with is critique. It's if you think about the sign of Virgo, for example, is very closely associated with having a keen eye for what can be improved and also what maybe isn't up to par. And this is quite mercurial. Robert Schmidt was one of the pioneers of Hellenistic astrology, or at least the reconstruction of it. He saw Mercury's primary role as being to contest and destabilize. And we really see a process of contesting what happened during the financial crisis with Occupy Wall Street. Around the same time, during this same period, so we're spanning here from 2008 to 2012, we also saw the first shoots of the Arab Spring. This man pictured here, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire in Tunisia as an act of protest, contestation against government corruption. So we saw the first spark here and the first sort of act of protest during this period. Now, following that period, Mercury then moves into the bound of Jupiter between 2011 and 2015. And what happened during this period? Well, those first sparks of the Arab Spring, which we'd seen with Pluto in the bound of Mercury, really exploded. And we saw the Arab Spring really consume the Middle East. And this turned into armed conflict in several of the countries in that region, including Syria and Iraq and Libya. And so one thing we associate Jupiter with, of course, is growth and expansion. So we can see a great process of expanding what was born with Pluto in the Mercury bound here. But also Jupiter is classically associated with faith. And what happened in this period? This was the period that ISIS, the Islamic State, emerged in Iraq and Syria. And so we really saw, Pluto is a planet that's associated with extremes it can often take things to extremes. And we see one of the world's great faiths here taken to a kind of almost extreme corruption of what it stands for, in the form of this very bloody movement which emerged, the Islamic State. So it's just, and if you think about, that was really, that ISIS period was our collective obsession at the time. All these stories that I'm bringing up here, I don't think I'm cherry picking we can find one here and one there. This was everything at the time. It was pretty much all people were talking about. At the time of the financial crisis, that was the collective obsession. And obsession, of course, is a very Plutonian thing. When we move into this period here, we became obsessed with ISIS, and it was, we couldn't see beyond that at the time. I remember people, writing essays saying, ISIS is, we're going to be dealing with them at the UN in 20 years. And it really seemed like, there was nothing else worth caring about at that time. Something else that happened at the same time in the United States was we saw the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was essentially a movement that was calling for justice in the legal system. Justice is, of course, a very classic association of Jupiter, and this movement was born of an injustice. It was George Zimmerman's shooting of Trayvon Martin in the US, which kind of led to this movement of people calling for justice in the legal system for people of color in the United States. So that was something else we also see with Pluto in the Jupiter bound. Now, what comes next? Well, we move into the Venus bound now. Pluto moves into the Venus bound in 2015, January 2015. I'm going to read something that Al-Biruni wrote about. Al-Biruni is a medieval astrologer. In the book of Instruction of the Elements of the Art of Astrology, Al-Biruni describes that, this is what he says about the classes of people associated with Venus. He says, nobles, plutocrats, queen courtesans, adulterers, and their children. So I won't draw too heavy a link here, but we have this fellow emerging at this time. We have a celebrity. We have, I think it's fair to say, a plutocrat. But really, Trump was, he came from the entertainment business, really. He was he had a television show. And he became, I think, Pluto's vehicle of transformation here. We have a television star, a celebrity. And once again, I don't think this is cherry picking, because Trump pretty much just dominated he became a collective obsession for so many people, and certainly by the media, for most of this period here, with Pluto in this bound of Venus. What else happened during this period? Well, you can possibly remember that Trump made was recorded making this statement about how he could treat women. He had that phrase, you can do anything, you can grab them by the pussy. This was a phrase that got into the news, and it really sparked something. Now, and what I'm talking about here is the MeToo movement. Now, the MeToo movement was born a bit before this period, but it really exploded here during this same period when Donald Trump was president of the US. And of course, what was this movement really about? This was women standing up and saying saying and talking about the abuse that they've experienced in their lives at the hands of men. So there's a very Plutonian process. There are hidden truths that are emerging into the collective. And it was a very powerful movement, and it led to the demise in public life of quite a lot of powerful men, particularly in Hollywood. We remember Capricorn having to do with institutions. What might the Venus bound of Capricorn have to do with? Well, the entertainment industry, Hollywood would surely fit that the Venus bound of Capricorn. So we have figures like Harvey Weinstein, who's actions were exposed during this period. And of course, Venus is a planet that was traditionally associated with women and was also associated with sex. And we can see both of those themes in what happened during that period. And these are, again, I just want to stress, I don't think I'm cherry picking stories here. These were the major obsessions of the time, in my opinion. And then, of course, then what came next? Well, we had Saturn's turn from 2019. And of course, we have the pandemic that came. Now, Saturn, a planet traditionally associated with death, with disease. We have a pandemic emerging, which obviously you don't need me to explain, what happened there, but we all know how powerful that particular incident was. Of course, Saturn being a planet associated with limits and restrictions, and I don't think many of us have been so limited or restricted as we were during this period. Pluto in the bounds of Saturn. Another story that emerged at this time during the same period, the other big thing that happened was the killing of George Floyd in the United States and the protests that emerged from that. And then the process of destroying and tearing down statues of men who were associated with the slave trade. Saturn is a planet that was known as the star of Nemesis, and it was said to be able to bring people to great heights, but also to bring them down again. And we see here the statues of men who had formerly been held to be respectable enough to be worthy of statues. Suddenly, those statues are being torn down during this period with Pluto in the bounds of Saturn. Saturn also associated with old and ancient things too. And then the next stage of all this, well, we have Pluto in the bound of Mars. And Mars is, of course, the planet of war. February 27, 2021, Pluto enters the Mars bound of Capricorn, which is where it is right now. I just pulled a quote from Wikipedia here, because obviously the war in Ukraine, which is now our new collective obsession, began February 24, 2022. That's where Pluto was in that final bound of Capricorn, 27 degrees and 39 minutes of Capricorn. But actually, Russia's preparations for this conflict began before that. This is just I just clipped this from Wikipedia, but it says here, in March and April 2021. So this was when we were still mostly obsessed with, the COVID pandemic. The Russian armed forces began massing thousands of personnel and military equipment near Russia's border with Ukraine and in Crimea, representing the largest mobilization since the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. Very soon after after Pluto enters, rather, the Mars bound, we get preparations for this war, which then, of course, breaks out in 2022. And, it was kind of interesting how quickly the collective obsession flipped as well. We went from the pandemic era into the war era almost overnight when that horrible war began. So those are the 5 bounds. Now, if we were to consider, how might we look at this transit of Pluto's, this 15-year transit through Capricorn overall? Well, as I said earlier, Capricorn is a sign that has to do with traditional institutions, or with large institutions in general. And we've really seen institutions be transformed over this period. If I've got this image here, you can kind of see, but the ideology that institutions, whether it's government, whether it's academia, media, NGOs and so on, civil society, the sort of ideology really that they profess is very much transformed over the period of Pluto moving through Capricorn. And I would argue that you could kind of see those themes emerging over that transit with where we started with Occupy Wall Street. We had things like Black Lives Matter. We had the MeToo movement, and a lot of these things have really fed into where we are now. I think if you think about institutions and how they legitimize themselves today, it's very different to 15 years ago. So that's just an observation of mine, and I won't go too much more into that because we have a bit more to get through. Because obviously we've had Pluto move through Capricorn, but now what we're staring down the barrel of is Pluto transiting through Aquarius, and indeed this transit has really already begun with Pluto's short stint in that sign earlier this year. So I wanted to mention a bit about Pluto in Aquarius. I've coined this term, maybe other people have coined it too, but Pluto-Aquarian, because I think I got bored of saying Pluto in Aquarius all the time. Pluto-Aquarian revolutions, and I've just plucked the last 3 of them here. So from 1286 to 1308, we have Pluto in the sign of Aquarius. This is the period when Marco Polo was in China and then returned with stories of this great civilization at the other side of the world, which really lit something, I think, in the European imagination in terms of their understanding of their own centrality in the world at that time. Marco Polo comes back and says, no, there's this magnificent civilization at the other end of the continent. If we move to the next one, 250 years later, 1532 to 1553, we have the era of the Renaissance and the Reformation. We have the Reformation began a little bit before this period with, I think it was when Martin Luther pinned his 95 Theses on the wall of the church. That was a little bit earlier, but this was when Pluto gets into Aquarius. The Reformation is really moving, and this is the period where Henry VIII, of course, declares himself head of the Church of England and severs himself and England from Rome. So we have a new center, a new religious center, a center of power, in a sense, being established away from the center. Then we move to the next one, 1777 to 1798. And of course, classically revolutionary periods, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And of course, with the American Revolution, we have a new center being established in a new place, a place across the ocean. And we also have the monarchy in the French Revolution being kind of, perhaps we could say, decentralized in a sense. So we find ourselves really at the dawn of another one of these periods, 2023 to 2044. Just a quick note on what I think's going on here. If we think about the sign of Aquarius, modern astrologers associate it with Uranus, and the traditional ruler was Saturn. And so, of course, we find the sign of Aquarius opposing Leo, the sign of the sun, just as the sun stands at the center of the cosmos, and Saturn sort of glumly patrols the outside of the cosmos, and at least was the boundary of the cosmos until we discovered the modern planets. But the theme of the displacement of the center, of new centers being established, seems to be quite core to what happens when Pluto moves through Aquarius. And now what we're going to do is look at what happened last time Pluto moved through the 5 bounds of Aquarius, between 1777 and 1798. So we have an example here to look at of what happens when Pluto moves through these 5 bounds. So before we get to Pluto in Aquarius the last time, just to note that the American War of Independence, or the Revolutionary War, as our American friends call it, began April 19th, 1775, with the Battle of I'm forgetting the name of the first battle of the war, but regardless, that's when it began. So we see April 19th, 1775. Pluto, you'll note, I have this image here, was in the Mars bound of Capricorn, just where it was, very close to where it was when the Ukraine war began, which is interesting to note because obviously the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, was important in driving what came during Pluto's last movement through Aquarius, including really driving the French Revolution. So just a quick look at the bounds of Aquarius. This time it's slightly different. So the first 7 degrees belong to Mercury, but then the next 6 degrees belong to Venus. Then we have 7 degrees for Jupiter, and then 5 degrees for Mars, and then 5 degrees for Saturn. So slightly different order, slightly different sizes of bounds. But let's go and let's have a look at what happened with Pluto in the bound of Mercury. Entered the bound of Mercury, so this the opening bound of Aquarius in 1777, was there until 1782. So what really happened during this period? Well, the American Revolutionary War was raging, and during this period, the French, as is well known, joined the Revolutionary War on the side of the Americans. And it's commonly held that the Americans may not really have been able to win that war without French help. But the French crown, ruled at that time by Louis XVI, the French crown had to spend a tremendous amount of money on this war, an estimated 1.3 billion livres, a hell of a lot of money. And essentially, France's participation in the war bankrupted the French state. It spent far too much money. It was terrible for the state's finances. And at this time, we meet this man here, Jacques Necker, who's a Swiss banker. He was established by the king as Director General of Finance for the French state. He was in charge of the French finances during this period. Now, he had a very difficult job, admittedly, but he's not really been looked at kindly by historians. He essentially had to borrow an enormous amount of money to finance their participation in the war, and then he hid those debts from the accounts. He made a public report of the French state's accounts. It was called Le Compte Rendu au Roi. This was the first time that the state's accounts have been published publicly. It was very Aquarian, but he hid, essentially, Necker hid the great great amounts of borrowing that he had to do for the French to participate in this war. And this was terrible for the French finances. And of course, going forward, the French state needed to try and recover this money through taxation. And this put a lot of pressure on the peasantry, the bourgeoisie, who were already feeling hard done by in the French state at that time. Now, what came next? 1782, Pluto moves into the bound of Venus. And during this period, we saw the eruption of the Laki volcano in Iceland. Now, volcanic eruptions, of course, they do happen pretty regularly, but nevertheless, an eruption is a Plutonian event. But what was really important here in terms of what we're talking about was the consequences of this eruption, because it essentially led to very wet, cold summers. It changed the climate in Europe, and harvests became very poor during this period. This essentially was terrible for the peasantry in France and for the people in Europe in general, and it really increased the pressure on the French people at that time. It's definitely been cited, the eruption of the Laki volcano has been cited as one of the major causes of the French Revolution, which comes with Pluto in the bound of Jupiter between 1785 and 1791. So storming of the Bastille here, 1789. Similarly, almost to the Arab Spring, we get into the bounds of Jupiter, and then the collective comes together. And it was during this period, of course, that that famous phrase, liberty, equality, fraternity, came into being. It's extremely Jupiterian sentiment. We have the issuing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Rights again being highly Jupiterian, and at the same time, in across the pond in the United States, you can see how we see different expressions of what's going on, because as the French are tearing their institutions down, the Americans are erecting theirs. This is when the presidency comes into action in independent America, where they found Congress, the Supreme Court, and all their institutions of law and administration, which is, again, Jupiterian. So what comes next? Of course, we're back to the bound of Mars from 1790 until 1795. Now, this period, the revolution really changes, of course. The fact that that this had happened was very disturbing to a lot of the monarchies in Europe, particularly Austria and Prussia. And they were very concerned with the fate of Louis XVI and massed their armies on the border with France. And France, during this period, 1792, if I'm not wrong, declared war on Austria-Prussia. So the first of the revolutionary wars really begins during this period, and it went really badly for the French at first. The Prussian Austrian armies almost made it to Paris before they were stopped. So it led to a very paranoid situation in France, in revolutionary France. And during the same period, the Jacobins, who are an extremely radical faction, one of their leaders here, Maximilien Robespierre, take over the revolution and initiate, in this very paranoid war atmosphere, the terror. One of the most, the famous next phase. So following, the Jupiterian periods that we remember well, comes the terror when Pluto is in the bound of Mars. And we have, during this period, the first appearance of the guillotine. Extremely martial. If you look at this period of the revolution, you'll see that the martial tone is pretty unmistakable. And we have one more bound to go. So what happened next? Well, this time Saturn takes the last bound of the sign, the last bound of Aquarius. So we have the final years of the revolution, and there was a real change of direction in the revolution during this period. The French started to win their wars. There was a less kind of paranoid atmosphere in Paris, and the need for it was no longer felt that there was a need for the terror. It started to look excessive. And so during this period, 1794, shortly after Pluto enters the Saturn bound, we have what's called the Thermidorian reaction, where Robespierre is arrested and then executed, and the revolution enters a much more conservative phase. They roll back the sort of extreme, some of the extreme policies of the Jacobins, and there's a real, it's almost like, it's kind of unmistakable again that the terror ends, but the revolution becomes much more conservative. And this is in the bound, Pluto in the bound of Saturn. So that's how you make a revolution. So you can kind of see there that these phases of the revolution, the French Revolution in particular, through as Pluto moves through these 5 bounds, of Aquarius. Now, I've used this rather silly image here, but I've used it for a reason. This is Pluto looking very pleased with himself. And this is an image that I've generated, of course, using artificial intelligence, using Midjourney, the Midjourney tool. And I've put this here just to bring us back to the present, where we find us now. So, where are we now? As we saw at the start of the presentation, Pluto is back in Capricorn, but the die is really cast now. We're already in the Pluto in Aquarius era. Things have been set in motion, I would argue, even though Pluto's just dipped its toes into Aquarius. So Pluto moved into Aquarius on March the 23rd of this year, stationed retrograde, and then left the sign on June the 11th. So, of course, Pluto spent this time in the bound of Mercury. Now, this 2.5 month period, if you're interested in, figuring out, what is going to happen to the world, what are we going to witness, what's coming during Pluto's 20-year pass through the sign of Aquarius, we were given a kind of look through the window at what's coming, really, because we had this little kind of this 2.5 month period where I would say that some of the things we saw are really omens of where things are going, through Pluto in Aquarius in general, and with Pluto in Aquarius in the Mercury bound in particular. So what were the major stories, the things that we saw during this period? Well, as I alluded to with my silly image, we saw the silly image of Pluto. We saw the rise of AI, and I think if you were following, it was really sort of March, maybe even a little bit before Pluto moved into Aquarius, that we saw this explosion of AI, new AI tools coming out, and suddenly our new collective obsession was here. And obsession is a good word. We were kind of hypnotized and obsessed with the transformative potential of AI. Now, of course, the technology itself has been in development for a long time, but the tools really started to come out. So ChatGPT, for example, I think it was earlier versions released with Saturn in Aquarius. So we have Saturn has already moved through Aquarius, and kind of we see the sort of building of these technologies in this time. But it was really the kind of transformative potential that sort of suddenly obsessed us and transfixed us and frightened us during this period where Pluto dipped its toes into Aquarius. So we have AI, and again, this is the bound of Mercury. Mercury is the planet that was traditionally associated with cleverness. And what do we have here? We have artificial intelligence. The mercurial nature of AI is really hard to miss. What were the other stories that I think were interesting? Down here on the bottom left, a UAP, an unidentified aerial phenomena, so UFOs and so on. There was this explosion in stories about UFOs suddenly, strange balloons in the sky above America, revelations from quite recently, actually, that the US government supposedly, and we don't really know what's true and what isn't because we haven't seen any proof yet, but supposedly, we have a whistleblower with quite good credentials, David Grush, his name is, coming out a few days before Pluto left Aquarius, saying that the United States has possession of UFOs itself, or 12 or 13 craft in its possession. And his story was confirmed by people still working for the US government. So again, are we looking at the identification of another intelligence somehow, or some intelligence, non-human intelligence. Mercury, planet of cleverness, again, strikes again. And then on a sort of on the geopolitical front, of course, we've had the war in Ukraine raging through this period still. Something that I think has been brewing in geopolitical terms is the rise of the BRICS countries as a bloc: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There were, during this period with Pluto and Aquarius, there were so many stories coming out almost every day about seemingly attempts by the BRICS to challenge the current global financial order, which all really goes back to the sanctions that were put on Russia at the early days of the war, which some countries viewed with horror because it was Russia's foreign exchange reserves which were being potentially frozen, and that was quite worrying for other states who also have foreign exchange reserves in Western banks and were concerned, are we going to have our own, we're going to be forbidden from accessing our own reserves. And we've seen a lot of moves towards so-called de-dollarization. The dollar, of course, remains the global reserve currency, and yet we've seen more and more stories of the BRICS starting to trade in their own currencies, or trade in China's yuan. All these kind of things. There's a growing queue of countries supposedly wanting to join the BRICS, including Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia being a linchpin of the petrodollar system that really contributes quite a bit to the financial dominance of the dollar. Now, where if you read quite a lot of mainstream commentators, they'll say that this isn't really viable. That the dollar as global reserve currency is pretty secure, and even people will kind of pour scorn on these kind of moves by the BRICS, and maybe rightly so at the moment. But I see this more as an omen of where things are going to go. This story was very prominent during this period of Pluto being in Aquarius, and you can see. I talked a little bit earlier about the theme of the displacement of the center, or of new centers being formed, which we saw if you look back at the other Pluto and Aquarius periods that I mentioned. We have Marco Polo in China, we have the Reformation, the church, the Henry VIII becoming supreme head of the Church of England. And then, of course, we have the revolutions of the last Pluto and Aquarius period. There's this theme of new centers being established, or the center being challenged. And it seems to me that we can maybe read that in what's going on now in the geopolitical realm, even if, there's still some distance to go, or that it may not come to much, or it doesn't look like it comes to much at this point. The fact that it was so dominant, I think, during this little Pluto and Aquarius preview period is worth paying attention to as a suggestion of where things may be heading in the next few years. I also have one more picture here, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, which happened just before Pluto moved into Aquarius. We've seen the collapse of more banks since, and particularly banks that are associated with the cryptocurrency industry. So that we see Pluto again sort of approaching, or in early Aquarius. There's more suggestions of financial crisis, I think, and just more broadly, I think we can see the looming financial problems quite clearly. So what we can really take from all this, the next few years, Pluto will, once it gets back into Aquarius, it will be in this Mercury bound. And I think that we'll see these kind of themes that I've identified here coming up again and again, but just generally the the mercurial nature of the themes we're going to see. I'm pretty confident that that's going to be clear. Just again, actually, another observation on displacement of the center with this story with these UFO stories that have been coming out, and even with artificial intelligence, there's a sense that, what's happening this time? Are we as human beings being somehow displaced from the center by artificial intelligences, or maybe even by these by unknown intelligences, which the US government is saying, at least branches of the US government or people who work for it are saying is out there now. So some observations there. And then I've just noted here what Pluto will be doing over the next couple of decades with the future. So Pluto will again move through these 5 bounds between 2023 and 2028 to be in the Mercury bound. Then we move to the Venus bound, 2027 to 2032, 2031 to 2037, the Jupiter bound, 2036 to 2040, the Mars bound, and 2039 to 2044, the Saturn bound. Now, I'm not going to try to predict now what's going to happen in each of these periods, but I put it here for you to consider, and you may well have your own thoughts on that. And then just one final note, what do we have here? What is this? What have I kind of revealed here? Is this some sort of crazy astrological scheme that purports to explain absolutely everything? I hope it doesn't come across like that. What I see this as is really another layer that we can use, particularly, in looking at mundane astrology. We can layer it with other techniques, looking at other cycles, looking at what else is going on. But I do think it's a layer of interpretation that we can add to our to work in natal or mundane work in this case. We can consider what bound is Pluto in, which one is it going into, and I think that this layer will give us an extra bit of interpretive power when we're trying to understand the times and predict what's coming. So, thank you.
Thank you.
That's my presentation. I've never given this presentation in this particular form before, and I've seemed to have managed to finish on time. So I'm quite pleased with myself.
Dan, thank you so much. That was just an absolutely wonderful encyclopedic tour through time and ideas as well. I love the way you went right back in history, but made it all so accessible and real.